introduce myself. My name is Tina Rambounilas, and I am a research director in environmental economics at Ayres here in Dijon. I'm honored to chair this plenary session this morning and to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Andrew Plantinga. He received his PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of Berkeley, and he is currently a professor of resources and land use economics at the University of Santa Barbara. He has spent his research career to the development of new empirical methods for estimating the impact of a range of environmental policies. For example, he and his colleagues have developed sophisticated integrated economic and ecological models to predict private land use decisions in response to policy incentives designed to increase the provision of carbon sequestration and species protection. He had gladly accepted our invitation because he loves French wine and cycling, but also he wished to share with us this morning his expertise and recent research on a key but very controversial topic, which are environmental markets. So, Andrew, it is a great pleasure to have you with us this morning. The floor is yours for, let's say, 45 minutes. Then we can move to the exchange with the public for the last 15 minutes. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Tina. Thank you to the organizers. It's really an honor to be here to give this address, and it's also wonderful, I should say, to be back in Dijon, a city that I like very much. So everyone can hear me okay? All right. So my topic is environmental markets. Is the promise fulfilled? Before I start to talk about research, I just want to mention briefly one of my affiliations, which is the Environmental Markets Lab. So Environmental Markets Lab is a group of faculty and staff researchers, postdocs, graduate students at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And our unit is designed to have really the kind of ambitious goal of addressing the world's most pressing environmental problems. Our approach is to think about market-based solutions to these problems, although we're not necessarily confined to that kind of approach. If you want to learn more about MLab, you can see the link there. Also, I'll be here at the conference all week if you'd like to come and talk to me to learn more about MLab, as well as to learn how you can be involved. There are lots of opportunities, so please don't hesitate to reach out. So what my talk is going to be about today is common pool resources. So I'm thinking about water, fisheries, forests, and the global atmosphere. The property that common pool resources have is that, first of all, they're rival. And that means that if one person uses some of the resource, there's going to be less left over for other people. The second property is that common pool resources, typically defining property rights for them is difficult, though not necessarily impossible. We know from human history that there's a problem with the commons. That is to say, common pool resources, especially if left under open access, which is a situation where anybody can go in and use the resource without limit, that these resources tend to be over-extracted and overused. I'll give you just one example, and that is groundwater, which is a resource I'll be returning to throughout the talk. So groundwater is a critical resource globally. It provides 50% and 40% of water for drinking and irrigation worldwide, respectively. However, if we look across the world at the largest aquifers, we see that 1/3 of them have declining water levels. So the water is being used up, and as the water gets used up, the water table declines, and that imposes a stock externality that makes it more expensive for everybody else to extract what remains. This groundwater scarcity is expected to increase under current demographic trends as well as climate change. Since at least the 1960s, economists have proposed a solution to this problem of the commons, and that is environmental markets. Two leading proponents of environmental markets, the American economists Terry Anderson and Gary Leibkap, put it this way: environmental markets are an effective and often underutilized option for improving water quality, providing habitat conservation, and encouraging investment in conservation of fish stocks. So how do these environmental markets work? Well, the first step is to define individual property rights to a share of the resource. This is a legal process that has to be gone through in order to basically define those rights and then allocate them to individuals. The second step is for a regulator then to set a limit on the total use or extraction of the resource, and then finally to allow these rights to be traded in a market. Now, in theory, environmental markets have a number of very desirable properties and clear advantages over other institutional regimes such as open access or traditional regulatory approaches. The first one is that the regulator, by setting the cap on total use or extraction, has control over how much of the resource gets used. The second nice feature is that trading will result in an allocatively efficient use of the resource. So if you, for example, have one person with a right to the resource who values it less than somebody else, there's an incentive then for trade to happen, and so that after trading happens, the resource should be held and used by those who value it the most. And then finally, if we compare environmental markets to other kinds of institutional regimes, particularly command and control regulations that dictate what kind of technology has to be adopted by users of a resource, we see that environmental markets have stronger incentives for innovation. So environmental markets provide this flexibility that allows users of the resource to basically figure out a solution to how they want to use that resource. Okay, these appealing features of environmental markets have resulted in them being adopted worldwide for many different common pool resources. If we look at air pollution, for example, we see that we have cap and trade programs for sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, CO2, lead, mercury, and more. To give you just one example of an environmental market for air pollution from my home state, California, we have there a cap and trade program for greenhouse gases. It covers approximately 80% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. The allowances, that's what the name for the rights to be able to pollute, these allowances are either free or they're auctioned, and then the regulator, the Air Resources Board of California, controls the cap or the total amount of emissions, and then has that cap decline over time in order to achieve emissions reductions. These allowances are tradable, although there are market stability provisions that I'll be talking about throughout the talk. In the case of California, the market stability provisions include a cap on the allowance price, or rather a ceiling on the allowance price, so prices can't go too high for rights. In addition, there's a limited use of offsets that's allowed. So if you hold an allowance, but you can find a cheaper way to achieve the same reduction in emissions, say by planting trees to sequester carbon dioxide, you can substitute to a limited degree offsets for allowances and then go ahead and sell those allowances. Okay, so that's air pollution. If we turn to fisheries, we see catch share programs, which are the analog to a cap and trade program, and we see them adopted for many of the world's fisheries. So in New Zealand, for example, there are catch share programs for 26 different commercial stocks. With water, we see water markets have emerged in many of the world's most arid agricultural regions: Australia, the Western US, Chile, South Africa, and China. In California, if we look at groundwater, 31 of our groundwater basins have what are called adjudicated water rights. That's the legal process I mentioned a moment ago through which rights are assigned to individual users. And then finally, we can think about payments for ecosystem services as being a kind of environmental market. There's a buyer who sets a price, and then a seller, for example, a landowner, who decides whether or not to offer ecosystem services at that given price. And we see throughout the world many programs that pay for ecosystem services in this way. Okay, so my talk is called Environmental Markets: Is the Promise Fulfilled? We see that there are these very appealing properties of environmental markets, but there are a number of reasons why we might wonder if they're going to work as well as they do in theory. First of all, there are theoretical considerations, namely that the effectiveness of environmental markets may be limited by things like market power, or inadequate monitoring and enforcement, asymmetric information, and other kinds of transactions costs. In practice, there are restrictions put on environmental markets, things like market stability provisions that I mentioned a moment ago with California's cap and trade program, and also often geographical limits on trading that restrict who can trade with whom in the market. Given these theoretical and empirical and practical limitations, it is ultimately then an empirical question whether environmental markets are going to improve on alternative institutions like command and control policies or even open access. So to put a fine point on it, the question I really want to answer is, have environmental markets generated net benefits? Now, a much more ambitious question would be, have environmental markets maximized social welfare? I'm not going to try to answer that question, which is a great question, but it's really hard to answer. I'm going to set my sights a bit lower and just say simply, can we establish that environmental markets have been an improvement over alternative institutional regimes? In other words, have they generated positive net benefits? Before I talk about some of the studies that have tried to estimate net benefits of environmental markets, I want to mention some of the challenges with actually measuring these net benefits. And there's really three different things to think about. The first one is scope. So in principle, we need to measure the effects of the environmental market on all the affected agents. This can be hard to do. If you think about an air pollution environmental market, for example, the benefits and costs could be very diffuse. There could be many different people affected, and it may not even be clear who those people are. And so in principle, we have to try to have a scope that encompasses all of the relevant agents affected. Time is important as well. If we think about the effects of environmental markets, they're often dynamic. So think about conservation of a fish stock. If you limit fishing today, that's going to mean that your stock is bigger, and if the stock of fish is bigger, it's going to grow more, and that results in more fish tomorrow. So in principle, we have to think not only about the current benefits and costs of an environmental market, but also future benefits and costs as well. And then one of the really tricky empirical challenges is the counterfactual. So what is the counterfactual? Often we see that environmental markets get adopted when the resource is critically overused. And that suggests that cross-sectional comparisons are likely to be misleading. We may not be able to simply look at a resource that's got an environmental market and compare it to another resource without an environmental market, because there could be underlying unobserved differences between those resources that led to the environmental market being adopted in the first place. If we think about the specific case of polluting facilities, we don't usually think of those as being randomly assigned to environmental markets versus other regulatory regimes, although I'm going to talk about a new working paper in which that is actually the empirical design that the authors were able to use to measure those effects. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at other studies in the literature besides my own that try to measure the net benefits of environmental markets. I should say that most studies do not actually get at the net benefit. What we have is mostly evidence that environmental markets increased benefits or reduced costs. So they're getting at a part of that, or at least evidence that's consistent with higher net benefits. And so let me start by talking about some studies that provide evidence of increased benefits. So let's start with emissions reduction. There's been a number of studies done on the European Union emissions trading scheme. For instance, this first one cited here, Petrick and Wagner, finds that it reduced carbon intensity in German manufacturing, resulting in overall emissions declines. There's another study of California's cap and trade program that found that not only did greenhouse gas emissions decline when that policy was put into place, but also, interestingly, emissions of other kinds of pollutants as well. And so there were co-pollutants that also were reduced as a result of the policy. There's a really nice paper in the AER by Olivier Deschênes and his co-authors. Olivier, by the way, is my colleague at UCSB and a director at MLab, like myself. He and his co-authors studied the NOx budget program, a cap and trade policy in the United States, finding that it generated annual health benefits of over $2 billion. There's also evidence from fisheries. So a study by Chris Costello and his co-authors, again, this is going to come up a lot. Chris Costello, my colleague at UCSB and also an MLab director, he and his co-authors found that under catch share management, the likelihood of collapse of global fisheries went down. And so collapse of a fishery means when the stock of the fishery gets so low, it gets so overfished that basically it enters a state where it can't replenish and rebuild. And so that likelihood of reaching that state goes down when catch shares are adopted. If we turn to the cost side, there's a number of studies that provide evidence that environmental markets reduce costs. Again, with the European emissions trading scheme, evidence of the adoption of low-cost technologies among regulated firms. Also in fisheries, evidence of a reduction in the race to fish. So one way that fisheries are often regulated is a total cap or a total quota, as it's called, will be placed on the fishery. However, individual rights will not be assigned. There will just be a total amount that can be caught, and then the season ends. Now, if you think about the incentives that get created, each individual fisherman now says, wait, I better go out and catch as much fish as quickly as I can, because if I don't, somebody else is going to do it. And so without the assignment of individual rights, what you end up having is what's called a race to fish. And there's lots of evidence that when catch shares get adopted, which assigns those rights down at the individual level, that the likelihood of that race to fish goes down. So we see things like increased season lengths as a result of catch shares. We see reductions in fishing in bad weather, and also higher revenues. So if you have a race to fish, all the fish gets caught at once, it gets sold all at once, that drives prices down, revenues are low. If you spread out that catch over a longer time period, revenues tend to go up. In water, we see evidence of increased water use efficiency. So that means that the same amount of output is being produced, but with lower water input in cases where water markets get adopted, and also avoided declines in groundwater tables. So in California, in places that have adjudicated those property rights, there's been a reduction in the water table going down, which means that the costs imposed on everyone of pumping the water have been avoided. Okay, so I mentioned that one of the tricky problems here with these studies is what is the counterfactual? So let me give you a flavor for what authors have done in order to establish that counterfactual. So Olivier Deschênes and his co-authors use a natural experiment involving a regulation that instructed states, US states, to adopt this cap and trade program. And what happened is that some of the states said, okay, we'll go ahead and do it. And other states said, no, we don't want to participate. And they sued the federal government and said so that they didn't have to participate. Eventually, they were forced to participate by the courts. But there was a period during which some of the states were participating in the cap and trade program, some of the states were not. And so what they did was to use that time period when the states were not participating in the program as the counterfactual for the states that were in the program. So that's how that was handled. Meredith Fowley has a really nice paper that exploits the structure of the Clean Air Act in the United States, where the way it works is if you're a county that has really high pollution, you enter what's called non-attainment status, and that means that you're under a set of very stringent command and control regulations. So they compared non-attainment counties to other counties which were participating in a cap and trade program for NOx, and that established a counterfactual was these non-attainment counties under command and control. I'll mention the last study by Michael Greenstone and co-authors. This is a new working paper where they're studying industrial plants in Gujarat, India. And what they were actually able to do was to randomly assign industrial plants to an experimental cap and trade program and then compare them as the counterfactual to plants that remained under command and control policy. So this is really sort of, you can think of the gold standard of how you establish the counterfactual in the case of trying to measure net benefits of an environmental market. Okay, so I've given you an overview of the literature that tries to measure net benefits of environmental markets. I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about one of my studies in somewhat more detail. So this is a paper called Do Environmental Markets Improve on Open Access? Evidence from California Groundwater Rights. My co-authors are Kyle Meng, who's also a colleague at UCSB and a director at MLab, and Andrew Ayres, who's a former graduate student from UCSB. This paper was published in the Journal of Political Economy last year. And so what we look at in this paper is groundwater. And so in particular, we're studying a groundwater resource called the Mojave Aquifer. You can see it in blue in this slide. And to give you a sense of where it is, that gray area is Los Angeles extending all the way down to San Diego. If you've ever been to Los Angeles and you look north, you'd see that there's a mountain range, and that mountain range is called the San Gabriels. If you go on the other side of that mountain range, you get to what's called the high desert. And this is the high desert. Okay, it's an extremely arid region, as you can see from the picture, but there's a lot of farming that goes on up there. However, to do any kind of farming, you of course need to irrigate because that's the only hope you have of growing anything that's green. So here's what farming looks like in the desert. And as you might have guessed, the way that the farming takes place up there, partly it's surface water supplies brought in from outside the region, but primarily it's by extracting water from the Mojave Aquifer. This is a picture showing the Mojave Aquifer over time, and particularly the depth to groundwater. So this is how far do you have to drill down before you get to water that you can then pump out. So if you look back in 1960, the depth to groundwater was about 60 feet. As time progressed, the aquifer was being over-extracted in the sense that more water was being taken out than was being replenished, and that necessarily means that the groundwater table is declining. By 1990, it had gotten down to about 90 feet, and all the users of the resource were concerned because one thing that happens is that the costs of pumping go up for everybody when the groundwater table declines. So what happened then is the users of the resource went through the process of adopting an environmental market, and in particular, assigning individual property rights through a process called adjudication. So what happened then? Well, you can see that after that period, the groundwater table was stabilized so that it remained up until the present day somewhere between 90 and 100 feet. Okay, so what does this environmental market entail exactly? Well, prior to the adjudication, so prior to the assignment of individual property rights, we had an open access situation or something very close to it. In order to use the resource before the adjudication, you had to be what's called an overlying user. You had to own land that lay on top of the resource over the groundwater aquifer. And under that situation, you could pump as much water as you wanted to. You could take out whatever you wanted. However, the way it worked under California law is that you didn't exactly own the water. In particular, you could not move the water or sell it to anybody else, but you could use as much of you as you wanted on your own land. And because people were pumping up a lot of water, that's why the groundwater table is declining. Then the environmental market comes in. And what happens is they went through the adjudication process, which assigned individual groundwater rights as a proportion of total allowable pumping. Total allowable pumping is set by an agency called the Mojave Water Agency. These rights are tradable, but they're called what they're called are paper water rights. So when you make a trade, either through an annual lease or a permanent sale, you don't actually physically move the water to the person who's buying it from you. You simply sell the right to pump from their location. Okay, so all of the users overlie the aquifer, so you don't have to physically move water. You can simply let them pump it from wherever they are. So what we do in the paper is then to look at the net benefits from this environmental market. And we have reasons to wonder whether the net benefits are positive and certainly whether they're maximized. Okay, so one reason we might not think they're maximized is just by looking back at this slide. The water table was stabilized between 90 and 100 feet. But that's just kind of where they happened to get to when they adopted the adjudication. There's no reason to think that 90 to 100 feet is somehow optimal as in terms of the level of the water table. In addition, there are spatial and temporal restrictions on trading, which suggest maybe the net benefits of the environmental market are not even positive. And furthermore, and importantly, property rights are incompletely assigned over the aquifer, which is one reason you might not think that the net benefits are positive, but for us, it's a good thing because it provides our identification strategy, as you're going to see in a moment. Okay, so here's the picture of the aquifer again, which is in blue. And what you see with the red and the purple lines are the boundary of the environmental market. So if you're within that boundary, then you have individual water rights that are tradable. If you're outside that boundary, then you continue as an open access user. Okay, so it's an incomplete regime. Some people have water rights and participate in the market. Others continue to be open access users. Now, we're going to treat this boundary as exogenous to the water market, so it's important to explain what these lines mean and how they came about. So there's two different ways to answer that question. First of all, look at the purple line. That is the drainage extent of the Mojave River, which you see running through the middle of the picture there. What that means is it's a topographical feature where if water falls on this side of that line, it flows to the river. If water falls, precipitation, I should say, falls on this side, it goes somewhere else. So that purple line is purely a topographical feature of the landscape that we can treat as exogenous to the environmental market. The other line, the red line, is the jurisdictional extent of the Mojave Water Agency. But importantly, that water agency was established back in the 1960s for reasons that had to do with surface water and were unrelated to the environmental market that later was put in place. So we're going to treat this boundary as in both cases, as basically exogenous to the environmental market, but do a whole bunch of tests to make sure that that's a reasonable assumption. All right, so how are we going to then, what's our empirical design? Well, we're in a potential outcomes framework where we're going to compare the value of land under different regimes. Now, we're looking at land values because the way, or you can think of those really, they're land prices. And the reason we're going to look at land prices is because in order to access the water, you have to have land, and that means that water rights are capitalized into land prices. So we can look at land prices and particularly differences in land prices and know that the difference is going to be the nature of the access that users have to water. Okay, so thinking about this in a potential outcomes framework, what we would really like to do is to compare the parcel on your left, which is the value of a parcel under full open access, to the value of that same parcel when it's under this incomplete property rights regime, and in particular when it's within that boundary which is shown by the dotted line. Okay, this is what we would like to measure, is this difference. However, of course, we can't do that because a given parcel of land is not under full open access and under incomplete property rights at the same time, but it's useful to think about what would be the ideal thing that we could try to compare. What can we actually do? Well, we can compare what we observe under the incomplete rights regime. In particular, what we have is a parcel within the boundary, which is labeled the value of which is labeled VMR. So M stands for the mixed regime or the incomplete regime, and R indicates that the value that parcel has rights. So we're going to compare the value of a parcel with rights inside the boundary to a value of a parcel that continues to be open access after the environmental market is adopted. Okay, so it's those two parcels are going to be what we measure. So in the paper, what we do is develop a dynamic theory in order to make sense of what are the various quantities that we would either like to measure or that we can actually measure. So let's start with the treatment effect. So ideally, we would measure the value of the parcel with rights under the incomplete regime to its value were it to have continued as full open access. And what we can show with theory is that this treatment effect has an ambiguous sign. The reason is as follows. When you adopt the environmental market, the water table is higher, which should raise the value of VM, the value of a parcel with rights. In addition, those rights are tradable. So a landowner who has those rights might be able to sell them to a city and make some money. Okay, so both of those things should make the value of a parcel with rights higher compared to its value were it to continue under open access. However, in order for that water table to be higher, it must be the case that pumping was restricted relative to open access, and so that has a countervailing effect that in general we cannot put a sign on. So the treatment effect has an ambiguous sign. Let's turn now to what we can actually measure, this estimated effect that is comparing the value of a parcel with rights inside the boundary to a value of a parcel outside the boundary that's open access. This effect has an ambiguous sign as well for the exact same reasons that I just mentioned, but then there's one further thing, and that is that this estimated effect we can show is a lower bound on the treatment effect, and that has to do with spillovers. So when the environmental market gets put in place, you have a bunch of users inside who are restricting how much they pump. That raises the water table. If you then have open access users who are outside of the boundary, who are pumping as much as they want, and their water table is going to be down like this, but gravity now takes over and basically makes water flow into that open access area. So that means that the open access users actually are better off with the environmental market because they get this spillover benefit of more water coming from the market where people have restricted their pumping. So this lower bound is important because now we can show with our estimated effect that we'll know that it's a lower bound on the ideal thing that we would be able to measure. Okay, so how about our data? Well, we have a data set on assessed land values for the period 1976 to 2015. So assessor data is often used, has the advantage of being available every year and for all the parcels. One of the nice things in our particular case is that there's a law in California called Proposition 13, which means that our data set, when we take all those land values from the assessors, is essentially a pooled cross-section or a pooled data from different periods of land prices, actual transactions prices. So you can think of these really as transactions prices and not assessor values that were developed according to some algorithm. We also know the location of the parcels, their size, when they were most recently transacted. We have other data on the slope and aspect of parcels. We have data on wells, and also we know a lot about the groundwater market itself. What are the endowments? What are trading volumes? What are prices? Okay, so if you hadn't guessed by now, what we're going to do is use a regression discontinuity design because we've got this nice boundary, and that allows us to compare parcels just inside the boundary to parcels that are just outside the boundary. In this picture here, the boundary is at 0, and then as we move to the right, we're into the adjudication area, or the area where there's the environmental market. If we move to the left, we're in the area where open access continues. And what you can see here is this gap, right, that's at the threshold, which suggests that the log land value is higher for in the environmental market area compared to the open access area. And specifically, the estimate, our main estimate, is 1.61, which translates, because that's in log scale, into a 219% increase in land value for parcels that are part of the environmental market and have rights. So to give you a sense of the scale, if we look 1 kilometer of the boundary in the open access area, the mean value of a parcel is $12,000. If we move just over the boundary into the environmental market, that value increases by $26,000. We do a back of the envelope calculation, which suggests that a basin-wide gain to agricultural users of 350 million. Further gains to urban users who now are able to buy water from agricultural users of about $100 million. And all of this compares to the original cost of the adjudication, that is the process of assigning rights through a legal process, of about $40 million. Okay, so that's evidence then that the net benefits from this environmental market are positive. It's important to note that one of the things that our RDD estimate misses is the effect of a higher water table. And the reason is that when we do that RDD estimate right at the boundary, of course, it's only valid right at that boundary. And at the boundary, the water table is the same for a parcel just inside compared to just outside, simply as a feature of because of gravity. Okay, so that means that our estimate is leaving out that effect of the higher water table and really capturing the gains from trade that are possible now for agricultural users who have these rights that can be traded. But we do go through a lot of other evidence that suggests that, in fact, the environmental market resulted in more groundwater for users with rights than would have occurred had they continued under open access. And I can talk about that if you want to hear more. Okay, if you write an empirical paper for the Journal of Political Economy, you have to do a lot of robustness checks. And we do many such robustness checks and placebo tests and all sorts of other things that I'm happy to talk about. But let me just move now to the question or the challenges that I mentioned at the start of the talk with empirical measurement and tell you how we handled those challenges in this paper. So the first one had to do with scope. So ideally, you would measure effects on all relevant agents. In our case, we have the population of overlying landowners in our sample. The only users who can access the resource are those who have land or are a city that's within that region. And so we basically have the whole population. And so we know that we're including everyone who's affected by the resource. We can handle time really nicely with land values. So one of the things I spend a lot of my time on in my research is analyzing property prices. And I like to look at property prices because in theory, under competition, property prices reflect the present discounted value of the infinite stream of rents available from a given property. And so that means in this setting that we should capture the infinite stream of expected benefits and costs from the environmental market because we're using land prices as well. And then when we think about the question, what is the counterfactual? Well, what we're able to do is to use those overlying land owners who continue under the open access regime to provide the counterfactual to those landowners that are participating in the environmental market. And so to conclude, I started out the talk saying with the question, environmental markets, is the promise fulfilled? And so the promise of environmental markets, again, is that you can assign tradable property rights that can reduce over-extraction and overuse of common pool resources and provide incentives for more efficient use. And I think if we look at the existing literature, we see very clearly that all the studies point to environmental markets generating positive net benefits. We see direct evidence of that in our study where we find higher net benefits from the adoption of this water market in California. In pollution markets, we see evidence of health benefits, induced innovation, and emissions reductions when cap and trade is put in place. With catch shares, we see avoided race to fish, avoided fisheries collapse, as well as higher revenues. And finally, in other studies of water markets, increased water use efficiency and avoided declines in water tables. And with that, I will finish, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Many thanks. Question from the public? Perhaps to let them prepare their question, I have a first comment. I'm not a specialist of regression discontinued design. I'm not, but I know in the public there are some people who work on that. So my comment, as you say, the market solution works if there are some kind of inequality. You know, you conceptualize this inequality as incomplete market.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here in France, there was a lot of debate, and stakeholders acknowledge that indeed some kind of water markets could be efficient, but the main problem is that it was become very controversial because of this kind of inequality introduced between farmers or between farmers and city dwellers. So
Yeah.
I want to have your comment on this.
Right. I mean, I think that those are always challenges. And so in California, we have a similar situation where there's lots of groundwater basins. They're over extracting the resource, and it would clearly be better overall if there was a market put in place, except that, of course, you've got to go through that legal process of assigning rights. And that's where it gets controversial, because there may be some people who think they're going to do worse under that environmental market, and they're going to resist the adoption of that. And so what becomes critical then in addressing that I see as sort of a political economy kind of problem is the way in which the allowances are allocated initially. So in principle, you can allocate those allowances initially in a way that, at least for the prescribed group of users, everyone should be better off because the value of the resource is higher, but it's still a complicated process to go through, and particularly when you think also about users like cities who are typically going to have a much higher value. If they end up acquiring all of the water rights, then what happens to the farming community and that was there already? I think that's always a big challenge, and there aren't a whole lot of easy solutions to it. But if the alternative is that the resource just keeps getting overused, that's not a very good situation either.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Can you give a microphone?
I can speak loudly. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm a researcher at Ayres here. Thanks for your fascinating talk. Could you expand a little bit on the free rider that is right by boundary?
Yeah.
I would have expected him to get the most of it. And I would have expected the guy who is right within the boundary to have his utility a little bit reduced because of this free rider that is right by. And in your graph, your discontinuity graph, you see that it's not the case, and it seems even to be the reverse. Like those who are further away from the boundary in open access, their prices are higher. Or not sure, but could you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So one thing is we want to be careful of putting a lot of significance on the slopes of those lines, okay? Because really, the only thing we're standing by is our effect right at the boundary. Because as we move away from the boundary, there could be other covariates that we're not necessarily controlling. Because the whole design, as I'm sure you know, is that any covariate that we observe or can observe should be varying smoothly across the boundary. Okay, but so I wouldn't put too much stock in those lines. But your question is a really good one about why is it that owner right inside the adjudication has a higher land value? You might think that it would be lower for the reason that, one, that owner just inside is restricted in how much they can pump, and compared to the landowner just outside. And furthermore, they have the same water table because it must vary smoothly across the boundary. So how could it be that land price is higher? And the reason has to do with the transferability of rights. And so if you're a water user, in the open access area, the only thing you're allowed to do is to pump the water and grow crops on your land. If you're a property owner within the adjudication area or within the environmental market, you also have the ability to sell those rights in the now or in the future to some other user who values it more, in particular a growing city within the region. So that is really what we're really picking up for those parcels right on the boundary is this this option to trade those rights either now or into the future. It's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you for a very elegant, provocative talk. You eschewed the question of social welfare beginning, and then there was a follow-up question about equity, equality. To what extent do you think is that interrelated with static versus a dynamic analysis and thinking about the environmental challenges across generations?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have a simple answer to that, but I agree that you know, in this case, when you define that environmental market, you're really picking those individuals who are going to benefit from the resource, right? And so you're saying here are the group of users who are going to get the rights. And then that necessarily excludes others who are either not given those rights and, you know, because they're not proximate to it or for whatever other reason. And I think that extends also to future generations. Okay, so yes, I think that's a hard part of that's a hard choice that has to be made. And so but you know, if you think, well, there's either that, or if you continue to use the resource in, say, an open access setting, then it's pretty clear that at some point it's not going to be, then benefits aren't going to accrue to anyone. But I completely agree that that makes for a difficult sort of political situation that can to some degree be handled through the initial allocation of rights. Because that's essentially defining the wealth that people have. So maybe there's creative ways to kind of address the equity issues for those who are not included through that initial allocation. I think there's ways to think about that. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm going to follow up on the same issue because it's true that a great talk, very interesting by the way. This graph is quite amazing. But this one thing that you kept mentioning was the first step is allocate the rights. Yeah. And so that's, I can see from a theoretical point of view that's why that's necessary. But I was wondering if you had any more information, having been on the field and in the actual communities, how that allocation tends to be done.
Yeah.
Because it is a very important point, who gets the rights. And
it is extremely important because it picks winners and losers effectively. I think there's a tendency for the way it gets done in practice most often is in a type of grandfathering. So they look at who was using the resource before, and then they use that as to somebody doesn't like my answer. Oh, it's all better.
Share your screen.
Right here. Oh, are there?
I'm afraid that page is free.
Sorry.
But yeah, so the way it's often done is through a sort of grandfathering process whereby you take, who is using the resource historically, and that becomes the basis for giving out those rights. I think if you think about the political economy, that is probably going to create the fewest problems, and so I think that's practically speaking why it's often done that way. But there's lots of reasons to not like that scheme either, because you're basically picking those who have used it and perhaps are the ones who've used it the most end up receiving those rights. So
Contentious.
yes, extremely. And so in the case of the Mojave aquifer, they tried one other time during that period of the graph when the water table was going down. They tried once and they weren't able to reach agreement, and then the second time they were able to do it. And so that legal process is really difficult. We see now in California with other groundwater basins which are in a similar state of declining water tables. In fact, it's so bad in some parts of California that we have what's called land subsidence. So if you think about it, if you got a lot of groundwater, you're kind of holding up the surface of the land. And there's places where the land surface has literally declined by 100 feet because of all the groundwater being pumped out. Okay, so that should tell you there's a problem. But nevertheless, the doing something about it is really difficult. There's a lot of momentum now towards adopting groundwater markets. However, there's still a lot of resistance because there are traditional users who feel, and perhaps rightly are afraid, that they're going to end up worse off if this environmental market gets adopted, which is certainly a possibility for them.
Perhaps the last question.
Patrick Rouhani from the University of Hanover in Germany. I'm not an environmental economist, but at first sight, when you presented, it seemed very encouraging. But because it seems that these markets can help to solve the problems. But you only mentioned one of the BRIC countries, China, that has adopted policies like that.
Yeah.
So my question is, how optimistic are you concerning the adoption of these policies in both industrialized and developing countries, emerging markets? Do you see a trend to adoption? Is it a widespread adoption?
Yeah, I think from where I sit, I am optimistic about the adoption of environmental markets. I think there was, at one time, if you look, say, 20 years ago, there was widespread skepticism about it, about environmental markets among environmental groups and among many others in the policy community. And I think that there's been a real shift in thinking and acceptance of that. So so in the sense of, the attitude towards adoption of environmental markets is something I think is, it's viewed very positively. I think it's a different question, though. Will there be enough momentum to adopt those kinds of measures in a way that can address the huge, complicated global environmental problems that we face? And that I'm not so sure about. I think we're going to see more environmental markets. Whether they're going to be sufficient to really address the big problems, I'm not sure. China it has embraced them for sure. And so we're seeing a lot more within China. When we think about climate change, one of the hopes is that maybe if we have air pollution markets, or CO2 cap and trade in different places, that there could be a way of harmonizing them eventually. So even if the United States doesn't adopt a national cap and trade program. We now have it in California, in the northwestern states, in the New England states, and maybe that's a good enough start to integrate those markets, achieve some of the efficiency gains from doing so, and perhaps then link them to other trading schemes as well.
Okay, so many thanks for this, as Valentin says, fascinating talk, and perhaps I know you are going to stay here for the next 2 days.
Yeah.
Yeah. So feel free to have a discussion with him. And